Power should answer to truth. Hit subscribe right now, because this story will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The bell above Rosie's diner door chimed on a rainy afternoon that smelled like burnt coffee and old vinyl seats. And nobody noticed the skinny black boy slide into booth 7 except the cop who had already decided he didn't belong there. A uniformed presence with a jaw tight from a bad morning and a badge that had learned to talk before the man behind it ever listened. And the boy, Malik Turner, no older than 16, kept his hands folded like his mother taught him. Palms open, eyes down. Hoodie unzipped to show he wasn't hiding anything, because in his world caution was a second language, spoken fluently and without accent, while the waitress, Marlene, poured water and smiled like she always did, and the TV above the counter muttered about traffic on I-95 and a senator's latest scandal, and for a moment everything was ordinary until Officer Grant Hale stood up from the counter stool and walked over with boots that announced authority louder than words, asking Malik what he was doing there, asking it like an accusation, asking it like the answer was already written. And Malik said he was waiting for his mom who worked the late shift at the hospital and had told him to grab a burger after school, and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because power rarely stops when it can keep going. And Hale asked for ID, and Malik said he didn't have one yet, and Hale's eyes flicked to the phone on the table. Cracked screen, cheap case, and he said, "Stand up." And Marlene opened her mouth to speak but thought better of it because she'd seen how these moments ended, and Malik stood, heart thudding, and said, "Sir, I didn't do anything." And that word, sir, carried a lifetime of training inside it. But Hale heard disrespect anyway, heard threat, heard something he could crush, and when Malik flinched as the cop's hand shot out. Not a punch, not a baton, just a slap sharp enough to ring through the diner like a dropped plate. Everything froze, the TV, the grill, the rain against the windows, and Malik's cheek burned and his eyes filled and he tasted metal. And Hale said, "Don't talk back to me." And somewhere in the back booth an old veteran clenched his fists, and Marlene whispered, "Officer, please." And Malik's phone slid to the floor buzzing because a call was coming in from a contact saved as dad. And Hale kicked it aside like it was trash, unaware that the man on the other end was Special Agent Marcus Turner. 15 years deep in the FBI, counterintelligence unit, a man who had spent his career tracking people who thought rules were optional. A man who had taught his son to keep his hands visible not because he was weak, but because the world sometimes demanded survival before dignity, and Hale cuffed Malik for disorderly conduct. A phrase so elastic it could wrap around anything, and dragged him toward the door as rain soaked the sidewalk and bystanders stared into their coffee. And Malik's mind raced through every warning he'd ever been given, every news story, every name turned into a hashtag, and he wondered if this was how stories started, with a slap that nobody stopped, while across town Marcus Turner felt his phone vibrate unanswered during a briefing about a domestic extremist cell, and irritation turned to unease because Malik always answered, and when the second call went to voicemail Marcus excused himself with the authority of a man who had earned it, stepping into the hall where fluorescent lights hummed and listened to a message left by a shaking waitress who had picked up the phone from the floor, saying only, "They took him." And Marcus didn't ask who because he already knew, and he moved like a storm contained in a suit, calling local precincts, flashing credentials, pulling strings that snapped tight because the system was suddenly pulling against itself. And back at the station Hale booked Malik with a smirk, telling another officer that kids needed to learn respect. And Malik sat in a holding room with a paper towel pressed to his cheek, replaying the slap, the sound of it louder than the pain, and he remembered his father's voice telling him that power without accountability was just violence with paperwork. And minutes stretched until an unfamiliar calm settled because sometimes the body protects itself by going numb. And then the door opened and the temperature in the room changed as Marcus Turner stepped inside with 2 agents and the precinct captain trailing behind, sweat on his brow, and Hale's smirk faded into something smaller when Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just looked at his son first, checking him with his eyes the way only a parent can, then turned to Hale and said, "Badge number," and Hale and said, "Badge number." And the words landed heavier than a shout, and Hale bristled, asking who the hell he was, and Marcus produced his credentials slowly, deliberately, FBI seal catching the light, and said, "I'm his father." And the room exhaled, and Hale laughed once, short and wrong, saying, "So what?" And that was the moment Hale made the mistake that would unravel him, because Marcus smiled, not kindly, and said, "So this is now a federal matter." and within hours the diners. Security footage was pulled, the SLAPS slowed to frame by frame, the sound isolated, the moment undeniable, and witnesses who had stayed silent found their voices when they realized the story wouldn't die quietly, and Marlene cried as she gave her statement, apologizing to Malik, who said it wasn't her fault because he'd learned early that apologies were often misplaced. And Hale was put on administrative leave, then suspended, then charged when an internal investigation revealed a pattern. Complaints buried, warnings ignored, a trail of small abuses that had never quite reached the surface until now. And the twists came fast, because the diner owner turned out to be Marcus's old academy roommate, because the veteran in Booth 9 had filmed the aftermath, because Hale's partner broke rank and testified, because the prosecutor, facing re-election, saw daylight and took it, and the town split the way towns do, yard signs arguing with each other, radio hosts shouting about respect. For police, while mothers talked about fear, and Malik, bruised but unbroken, went back to school where whispers followed him like shadows, and he wondered if being the son of an FBI agent made him safer or just more visible. And Marcus sat with him at the kitchen table every night, teaching him that justice was a process, not a moment, that winning wasn't the same as healing. And when the trial came, the slap was played again, and Hale watched himself on the screen and tried to explain how stress made him act, how he felt threatened, and the jury watched Malik stand straight and tell the truth without ornament. And the verdict came back guilty, and some people cheered and others shook their heads, and Hale lost his badge and his pension and later his freedom, and the town moved on the way towns do. But something had shifted, because cameras stayed on a little longer, because a training program was rewritten, because a diner became a landmark, and Malik grew, scars fading, resolve sharpening, and years later he would sit across from his father, older now, and talk about joining the bureau, not for revenge but for balance, and Marcus would nod, knowing the cost, knowing the weight, knowing that one slap in a diner had revealed a fault line and a chance. And if you stayed with this story until the end, if you believe stories can change what we tolerate, then subscribe now, because the next one might be happening down the street, and attention is the first step toward justice.